Maritime patrol aviation in the Atlantic during the Second World War has been characterized as thousands of hours of monotony punctuated by moments of absolute terror. On 7 December 1941, patrol aviation in the Atlantic was organized under Commander Patrol Wings, United States Atlantic Fleet. 5 wings were positioned as follows: Patrol Wing 3, Coca Solo, Canal Zone, Patrol Wings 5, 8, and 9, Norfolk, Virginia, and Patrol Wing 7, Argentia, Newfoundland. 12 Atlantic patrol squadrons were equipped with various models of the consolidated PBY Catalina, with one squadron flying the Martin PBM Mariner. An additional squadron was transitioning to the Lockheed PBO Hudson. Atlantic patrol aviation under Atlantic Fleet assignment was heavily engaged in neutrality patrol operations over a wide area. Patrols were flown from Iceland, Newfoundland, Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, and Brazil. Commander Patrol Wing 3 covered both the Caribbean and the Pacific approaches to the Panama Canal. Those few squadrons not flying neutrality patrols were occupied with providing operational training to recent graduates of the flight training programs or in transition training of squadrons re-equipping with new aircraft. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, Patrol Wing 8 and 4 PBY squadrons were transferred to the Pacific. For practical purposes, the east coast of the United States had been stripped of its patrol aviation shield. Following the German and Italian declaration of war against the United States on 11 December 1941, patrol aviation remaining in the Atlantic had its hands full with escort of North Atlantic convoys and stepped-up patrols from the offshore bases. Very unlike current operations under unified commands supported by extensive worldwide command, control, communications, and intelligence systems, anti-submarine air operations up to 150 miles off the east coast at the time of the initial German submarine offensive were conducted under the operational control of Commander North Atlantic Naval Coastal Frontier as a task force commander under Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet. This control was exercised through the commandants of the 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Naval Districts. Forces assigned were those of the Naval Local Defense Forces drawn from air assets of the respective Naval District Commandants. Control was normally through naval communications facilities at the base of flight origin. Communications between bases and with the naval coastal frontier were very limited. Long-range flight communications utilized high-frequency continuous wave, with voice communications limited to short ranges. Very few frequencies were available to each aircraft, and coding was manual through the use of strip ciphers or code books. The Battle of the Atlantic, from its inception in September 1939 until 8 May 1945, was a battle for the protection of shipping. Supply and troop transport waged against the German submarine force, supporting Luftwaffe aircraft and occasional surface ships and Italian submarines. With the exception of those patrol organizations including Fleet Air Wing 5 after September 1943, in operational or transition training and new squadron establishment and workup, patrol aviation was fully engaged in the Battle of the Atlantic. The American patrol aviation forces were only a portion of the much larger mixture of land, sea, and air resources involved in what has been termed history's longest, most expensive, and most critical naval battle. The objective of anti-submarine warfare is to deprive the enemy of the effective use of its submarines. To this end, the recording of submarine losses tells just a small part of the story. Particularly, sightings by aircraft radioed ashore or to surface craft often resulted in numerous attacks by other surface or air units. In 1942, submarines were ordered to dive when they sighted an aircraft. Consequently, air patrols in the vicinity of surface vessels or convoys often contributed to the submarine's inability to position for an attack and thus indirectly contributed to the objective. Through the fall of 1941, most submarine operations in the Atlantic had been conducted against areas of shipping concentration and against convoys to and from Canada and the United Kingdom. Commander Patrol Wing 7 operated as a task group commander under Commander Support Force, Atlantic Fleet. Patrol PBY squadrons VPs 71, 72, and 73, and PBM Squadron VP 74 supported convoy operations from Newfoundland and Iceland with primitive facilities and fierce winter weather conditions. Since operating conditions were becoming impossible for flying boats, a plea was made for land-based aircraft. In order to meet this immediate requirement, the Navy was able to divert 20 Lend-Lease Lockheed Hudsons from those destined for the Royal Air Force. These aircraft, the Navy's first land-plane patrol bombers, were designated PBO-1. Retreating before a determined British offensive in the autumn of 1941, the situation of the German Afrika Korps was critical. Hitler, with no prior warning of plans for the Pearl Harbor attack, ordered that most submarines be withdrawn from the Atlantic to operate against British shipping in the Mediterranean. Shortly after, Germany and Italy declared war against the United States, with Admiral Karl Dönitz as Commander-in-Chief. U-boats received permission for submarine operations off the east coast of the United States. With the departure of Patrol Wing 8 and 4 PBY squadrons to reinforce the Pacific Fleet in mid-December, the North Atlantic naval coastal frontier was left with only a few training squadron PBYs and Coast Guard aircraft, and some trainers and carrier aircraft. When the German attacks on East Coast shipping began in January 1942, the Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, refused a request for transfer of Atlantic Fleet aircraft to the naval coastal frontiers. In February, permission was granted for fleet aircraft to be used by coastal frontier commanders in emergencies only and not for routine patrols. Commander North Atlantic Naval Coastal Frontier also asked for and received operational control of 9 Boeing B-17 heavy bombers, 6 Douglas B-18s and 31 North American B-25 medium bombers from the Army's 1st Bomber Command. These aircraft carried only demolition bombs and flew only daylight missions, but they flew and fought. Inshore anti-submarine patrols up to 50 miles off the coast were flown by the Coast Guard, Army observation squadrons, and trainers, and after March 1942 by the Civil Air Patrol in support of Navy tasking. Also in March, a number of Vought OS-2U Kingfisher aircraft, originally destined for the British, were assigned to inshore patrol squadrons. Admiral Dönitz named his first mission against the East Coast Operation Drumbeat. The first sinking occurred 300 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, on 11 January 1942. The 5 U-boats which comprised the first group were detected by communications intercept and accurately plotted and reported by United States Naval Intelligence in the estimate for 12 January. Unprepared to conduct anti-submarine warfare, and without effective command, control and communications support, the meager surface and air forces available in the North Atlantic naval coastal frontier were unable to cope with the German offensive. During the first quarter of 1942, 60 ships were sunk by U-boats in the area. Remedial action where possible was slow in coming. Lights along the coast that silhouetted ships offshore were never blacked out and were only dimmed after strong representation by the Army. Effective anti-submarine search and localization devices were not available, and the only anti-submarine weapon, the depth charge, had limited lethal range. As the German offensive gradually worked its way south along the coast, detachments of patrol aircraft were established at various points along the coast to enable them to base closer to their patrol areas. With the establishment of coastal convoys and the organization of the Eastern, Gulf, Panama and Caribbean Sea Frontier Commands in April 1942, the command and control system for prosecution of anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic began to take shape. Aircraft production and training programs at this time could not fill the worldwide force requirements, and shipping losses were enormous. 154 ships lost in areas covered by American patrol forces, with the loss of only 2 submarines, U-656 and U-503. Both were credited to VP-82 flying the PBO-1 Hudson, the first German submarine sinking attributed to United States forces in World War II. As the pressure of the coastal convoys began to take effect in the second quarter of 1942, the main offensive moved with a vengeance into the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Whereas the losses during the first quarter were 51 ships, the second quarter losses counted 167 ships in these areas. During the quarter, only VP-74, flying the PBM Mariner, scored an elimination, sinking U-158. Additional PBY squadrons came online as fast as they could be trained, but the build-up was painfully slow as the demands of the Pacific Fleet were critical at this time. Deliveries of the PBM-3 to patrol squadrons were subject to production and configuration delays. A decision in 1920 precluded the Navy from developing land-based patrol aircraft. The Navy's request for these aircraft was not favorably resolved until July 1942. At that time, an agreement with the Army resulted in the release of consolidated B-24s, North American B-25s PBJ-1s, and Lockheed B-34s PV-1s. These additional aircraft were pressed into action as soon as squadrons could be formed and crew trained. The summer of 1942 saw greatly increased concentration of submarine activity against the North Atlantic convoys and Canadian coastal zone shipping, with the third quarter loss of 68 ships. A substantial decrease in losses was experienced in the eastern and Gulf Sea frontier areas, but continued strong activity in the Caribbean resulted in quarterly losses of 93 ships. Losses in the Brazilian area continued a small increase to 10 ships. Partially offsetting these losses was the increase in submarine sinkings attributed to American air patrol activity. In July, the Army's 396th Bombardment Squadron sank U-701, VS-59, a patrol wing 3 inshore patrol squadron, joined surface units to sink U-153, and VS-9, an Eastern Sea Frontier inshore patrol squadron, joined with a merchant vessel to sink U-576. In August, Coast Guard Squadron 212 sank U-166 in the Gulf of Mexico. In August 1942, Patrol Wing 11 was established at San Juan, PR, and was assigned to the Caribbean Sea Frontier. In September, Patrol Wing 12 was established at Key West, Florida, assigned to the Gulf Sea Frontier. These commands improved the administrative and material support for squadron operations in their respective areas. Also in September, headquarters squadrons were established in each wing to provide for the administration of the wing and attached squadrons. They also accomplished the maintenance and repair of all squadron aircraft by pooling all equipment and spare parts, and by transfer of ground personnel from squadrons to the headquarters squadron. Thus, squadrons were composed primarily of flight crew which, being freed of most administrative and maintenance responsibilities, could concentrate on flight operations. Headquarters squadron detachments, called patrol service units, provided maintenance services to deployed wing squadrons and detachments at outlying bases. In October, the inshore patrol squadrons were assigned to the administrative control of the patrol wings. Operational control remained with the Sea Frontier commanders. On 1 November 1942, patrol wings were designated Fleet Air Wings as the basic structure for shore-based air, and were to be composed of any types of aircraft required by the wing to perform its assigned functions in a peculiar area of operation. As anti-submarine measures became more effective, and as the number of squadrons available provided greater coverage, the effectiveness of submarines in the Caribbean area was sharply reduced. Admiral Donitz shifted his area of concentration to the north. In the last quarter of 1942, losses mounted in the North Atlantic convoy area to 70 ships, and decreased in the Caribbean to 48 ships. Losses mounted to 23 ships in the Brazilian area and to 35 ships in the southeastern Atlantic. There were no losses in the last quarter of 1942 in the Eastern, Gulf, or Panama Sea frontier areas. U-512 was sunk by the Army's 99th Bombardment Squadron and U-408 by VP-84 in October. U-611 was sunk by VP-84 in December. The decisive year in the Battle of the Atlantic was 1943. With increased numbers of submarines available, Admiral Donitz formed large wolf packs to operate against the North Atlantic convoys. VP-83 sank U-164 and U-507 in January, and the Army's 2nd Anti-Submarine Squadron, assigned to Fleet Air Wing 15, sank U-519 in February. In March, U-156 fell prey to VP-53, and U-524 to the Army's 1st Anti-Submarine Squadron, also of Fleet Air Wing 15. The second quarter results were even better. In April, VP-83 sank the Italian submarine Archimedes, while VB-125 sank U-174. May saw the loss of U-657 and U-467 to VP-84. VS-62, a Fleet Air Wing 12 inshore patrol squadron, and a Cuban gunboat joined to eliminate U-176. VP-74 and surface units sank U-128. June brought the demise of U-388 and U-200, both to VP-84. The fierce attacks against the convoys reached a climax in the spring of 1943. A number of significant factors contributed to the Allies turning the tide of battle. Training programs and production lines combined to furnish the well-trained personnel, ships, and aircraft required to provide the necessary protection for shipping. Atlantic patrol squadrons had increased in number from 16 in July 1942 to 30 on 1 January 1943. Long-range B-24, PB-4Y-1 Liberators provided the range to help close the mid-ocean gap, along with the increasingly available Hunter-Terminator groups composed of escort carriers, their air group, and accompanying surface escorts. A very important factor was the availability of 10-centimeter airborne radar, which effectively reduced the ability of U-boats to remain undetected while repositioning on the surface. In the face of determined opposition, the Germans were subjected to grievous losses, and on 24 May 1943, Admiral Dönitz withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. In July, a decision was reached to assign all PBMs to the Atlantic Fleet for anti-submarine operations. It was not until December that PBMs would be assigned to the Pacific Fleet. Also in July, 2 squadrons of PB-2Y Coronado flying boats were added to the patrol forces, and the first of the acoustic anti-submarine aerial torpedoes FIDE reached the fleet. The build-up of patrol forces was accompanied by more responsive command and control measures, more reliable communications and proven tactics, which were widely disseminated and taught in the various training establishments supporting the fleet. With the advent of more and better equipment and additional squadrons to put on task, submarine losses to patrol aviation mounted through the summer. In July, VP-32 sank U-159, U-759, and U-359. VP-94 sank U-590 and U-662. U-135 was eliminated by VP-92 and British surface units, while bombing squadron VB-107 tallied U-613. VP-74 sank U-513, and in coordination with 2 Brazilian patrol planes, sank U-199. U-43 was sunk by VB-127. In August, U-572 was dispatched by VP-205. In an 8-hour battle involving 7 PBMs, a PV, an Army B-18 and a K-type blimp, U-615 finally succumbed to the combined attacks of VP-204, VP-205, VB-130 and the 10th Bombing Squadron Army Air Force, with the assistance of ZP-51. Also in August, VB-129, VP-107 and United States ship Moffett combined forces to sink U-604, and Fleet Air Wing 7 deployed to the United Kingdom for operations under control of 19 Group, Royal Air Force Coastal Command. In September, U-161 fell prey to VP-74. Also, the operational units of Fleet Air Wings 5 and 9 merged into Fleet Air Wing 9. Headquarters moved to New York, and Commander Fleet Air Wing 9 assumed additional duties as Eastern Sea Frontier Air Officer. Fleet Air Wing 5 became the Atlantic Fleet Training Wing for the remainder of the war. Also in September, Army anti-submarine units and Civil Air Patrol units supporting the Eastern Sea Frontier were replaced by units of Fleet Air Wing 9, and Civil Air Patrol units were no longer assigned to Gulf Sea Frontier operational control. Following the withdrawal of submarines from the North Atlantic convoy area, Admiral Dönitz sent his force to operate in distant waters. This was done to preserve as much of the force as possible until new developments would again allow a return to attack on the vital North Atlantic convoys. These developments included installation of improved 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, the acoustic torpedo, a new radar countermeasures receiver, and a new radar decoy. Aerial reconnaissance by Luftwaffe Focke-Wulf patrol planes provided advanced warning and location of Gibraltar and other southbound convoys. The submarine offensive in the Bay of Biscay and the other more remote operating areas proved to be costly, largely due to excellent Allied communications, intelligence, and the new 10-centimeter radars about which the Germans had no information. Losses through the summer and into the autumn convinced Admiral Dönitz to conclude in his memoirs that the era of success has ended. All we could now hope to do was fight a delaying action and to tie down the forces of the enemy. Submarine losses to American patrol aviation during the fourth quarter of 1943 included U-336, which fell to VB-128 in October, U-848 and U-849 sunk by VB-107, U-966 sunk by VB-103, VB-110 and a Royal Air Force check-manned B-24, and U-508 annihilated by VB-103 in November. From November 1943 through the end of May 1944, the U-boats were important to Germany only in that they kept Allied shipping in convoy and tied down increasing numbers of anti-submarine warfare forces. During this period, Atlantic patrol aviation grew to peak at 25 patrol and 20 bombing squadrons. Significant new systems came into use and contributed to success. The sonar buoy, introduced in June 1943, and the L-7 searchlight, first used in a night attack in December. Magnetic anomaly detection equipment was introduced in early 1944, and rockets were fitted to the PV in February. Submarine losses to patrol aviation counted U-271 sunk by VB-103 in January, and U-177 sunk by VB-107 in February. U-761 was detected attempting to pass through the Gibraltar-North Africa Magnetic Airborne Detectors Barrier and was sunk by the concerted efforts of VP-63, VB-127, the Royal Air Force and 2 surface units. March and May saw the loss of U-392 and U-731, both to VP-63 and 2 surface units. In an attempt to foil Allied plans for a possible invasion, Admiral Dönitz communicated anti-invasion dispositions to his submarines in May 1944. Communications intelligence intercepted and decoded this information. When the Germans recognized the Normandy landings were underway, Dönitz signaled execution of his plan. The intense Allied anti-submarine efforts which followed prevented significant loss to the invasion forces. The invasion of France, Allied countermeasures, increased air patrols, and the availability of timely, accurate and decrypted radio intelligence worked together to drive the U-boats from their French bases. The availability of the snorkel underwater breathing device enabled many to evade, but the submarines were never an effective force after August 1944. The only submarine loss to American patrol aviation during the remainder of 1944 was U-863, sunk by VB-107. On 1 October 1944, all VP and VB squadrons were redesignated VPB multi-engine patrol bombing squadrons. In February 1945, U-327 was sunk by VPB 112 and 5 surface units. U-680, one was sunk in March by VPB 103. And the last U-boat lost to American patrol aviation in World War II was U-1107, sunk by VPB 103. The European War ended with the surrender of Germany on 8 May 1945, VE Day. The Germans hoped to deploy their new design Type 21st, 23rd and 26th submarines, with submerged endurance and high underwater speed, in numbers which would change the outcome of the war. Like many other German miracle weapons, the advent of these submarines was far too late to have any effect on the war. Only 2 Type 21 boats came into service. In the final analysis, patrol aviation in the Atlantic in World War II played a significant role in winning the Battle of the Atlantic and established the basis for future American and Allied advances in air anti-submarine warfare through the years of the Cold War submarine threat and up to this time. Early in 1944, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff directed Allied forces in the Pacific to begin an offensive towards the Philippine Islands. The recapture of these islands would be a major step in the defeat of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Operating from bases in the Philippines, the Allies could cut supply lines to the rich, conquered territories of Netherlands East Indies, French Indochina, Thailand, Burma and Malaya. These losses would also support further advances against Formosa, the China coast and the home islands themselves. Almost as soon as General Douglas MacArthur assumed command of the Southwest Pacific area, after being ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines, he began planning his move back to the Philippines. He visualized this as a succession of amphibious landings along the north coast of New Guinea and into the southern Philippines. This approach, he felt, could quickly achieve the strategic objective of cutting supply lines to the Netherlands East Indies. However, this concept did not coincide with that of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had decided that an advance through the Central Pacific would be strategically more effective. In direct conflict with General MacArthur's concept, the Joint Chiefs of Staff felt that the longer Southwest Pacific route would be more costly in terms of men, aircraft, money, time, and ships. A seldom considered point was that the Central Pacific route was better because there would be less jungle and swamp warfare with attendant tropical diseases than would an approach through New Guinea. Finally, there was a practical limit to the air and ground forces which could be deployed on the small Central Pacific islands, while these assets could be placed on New Guinea and the islands between it and Mindanao in quantities limited only by the availability of shipping. Another factor that weighed heavily in Joint Chiefs of Staff thinking was the potential of the Army Air Force's new offensive weapon, the B-29 bomber. Joint Chiefs of Staff plans called for extensive bombing of the home islands, but there was some doubt concerning the continuing operations from bases in China. However, air bases in the Mariana Islands, less than 1,500 miles from Tokyo, would provide B-29 bases that would be unable to be retaken. While all of these factors made the Central Pacific approach strategically, tactically, and logistically best to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they also felt it would be undesirable to move all Allied forces from the Southwest and South Pacific areas out of contact, which had been established during the campaign to reduce Rabaul. They felt that the utilization of both routes would prevent knowing where the next blow would fall. The Joint Chiefs of Staff made the decision that the approach to the Philippines would be made through both routes but with priority to the Central Pacific, which appeared strategically more decisive. Central Pacific forces would move towards the Philippines by way of the Marshalls, Carolines, and Palaos, while South Pacific forces would move up the northern coast of New Guinea and into the islands between the northern peninsula and Mindanao. Upon reaching the northern peninsula of New Guinea, it would become necessary to protect both flanks prior to moving north into the Philippines. Halmahera, on the left flank, was a principal distribution point for the eastern part of the Netherlands East Indies and became a focal point for the defense of the southern approaches to the Philippines. On the right flank, the Palau in the Western Carolines were heavily defended, and as the operations in the Marianas were taking longer than expected, the decision was made to occupy only the three largest islands in the southern portion. Airfields could be developed on Angkor, Peleliu, and possibly in Jezebus to extend Allied control over the Western Pacific and support the Philippine invasion. The enemy had prepared an elaborate defense system in the southern Palaos to stop invaders at the beaches. In the event these failed, the defenders were to fall back to previously prepared defenses inland, utilizing the caves and natural terrain features of the ridgeline down the center of the island. Task Force 38, under Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, was to conduct strategic air support missions hitting enemy naval forces threatening landing operations in the Western Carolines. He was also to provide air support for the simultaneous landings at Morotai north of Halmahera and in the Palaos. The 3rd Amphibious Corps was under the command of Major General Roy S. Geiger, United States Marine Corps, a naval aviator, who was to be the ground force commander for the attack on the Palaos. This force basically was composed of the 1st Marine Division and the 81st Infantry Division, United States Army. The attack of Morotai was to be conducted by the 31st Division, United States Army. Little resistance was expected against the Morotai invasion, and since it was extremely important to rapidly develop airfields on the island, there was no preliminary air or naval bombardment prior to day that would prevent a tactical surprise. However, land-based Allied aircraft did conduct heavy raids on enemy bases within range of Morotai. Air support on D-Day was provided by Task Force 38 and escort carrier CVE-based aircraft, which continued to provide support until airfields were constructed. Landing on 15 September 1944, the 31st Division met little opposition and quickly moved inland to take its objectives. Enemy troops on Morotai showed little offensive spirit, choosing to escape rather than to attack or defend prepared positions. Nor did the enemy command at Halmahera reinforce the island. Airfield construction proceeded slowly due to lack of adequate good surfacing material, as well as bad weather conditions. The far-ranging 3rd Fleet carriers providing air support for the Palau and Morotai operations reported enemy strength in the southern Philippines to be weaker than expected. Based on the decision to bypass some of the islands in the Western Carolines that had previously been marked for attack, release of troops assigned to these attacks made it possible for General MacArthur to plan an attack directly to Leyte, bypassing Mindanao. While there were no actual sorties flown against Leyte by Morotai-based aircraft, they did fly support over southern Mindanao and later against targets in the Netherlands, East Indies, and the oil centre at Balikpapan, Borneo. The Morotai fields, secured at an extremely low cost, were well worth the taking. Fast carrier strikes in the Palaos began on 6 September, D-9. They also provided close air support on day at Peleliu. Gunfire support commenced on D-3x4 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 9 destroyers. On 18 September, simultaneous with the Morotai landings, the 1st Marine Division began landing on Peleliu. Initially, it was anticipated that Peleliu would be a tough but short operation which could be secured in 4 days. As the amphibian vehicles crossed the reef, they, and the beach, were subjected to mortar, artillery and automatic weapons fire from the high ground of Peleliu's central ridge system. As succeeding waves pushed ashore, enemy fire steadily increased, providing ample evidence that the preliminary air and naval bombardment had not been as effective as hoped. In 2 days of heavy fighting, the most important objective, the Peleliu airfield, had been secured but at a cost of almost 1,500 Marine casualties. The enemy commander withdrew his forces to the ridgelines and high ground north of the airfield. Against stubborn resistance and with reinforcements being sent south from the more northerly islands, it was evident that additional troops would be needed to destroy the enemy. After a week of extremely strenuous combat, the 1st Marine Division had been temporarily halted. The division had lost just under 4,000 men. The 1st Marines had been virtually eliminated as a combat unit, with the 7th and 5th Marines also suffering heavily. Major General Geiger directed that the 1st Marines be evacuated from Peleliu and that the 321st Regimental Combat Team be attached to the 1st Marine Division. By the end of September, Peleliu had been secured at the cost of 5,300 American casualties. The airfield, which was the primary purpose for seizing the island, was operational for fighter aircraft. This certainly did not mean that the fighting was over. When the 3rd Amphibious Corps headquarters moved ashore on 12 October, Major General Geiger declared that the attack and occupation phase of operations on Peleliu had ended. Yet, strenuous fighting remained to be done to blast the remnants of enemy defenders from their final ridgeline positions. The 1st Marine Division left the island on 30 October, having suffered 6,526 casualties. Army units continued the fighting until 27 November, when hostilities finally ceased. The operation, which had been expected to last only 4 days, had continued for almost 2.5 months. After Gori Peleliu was all over, it never served the purposes originally envisioned. The airstrips were not operational in time to directly support the Philippine landings as planned. It was not until 17 November that the first bomber mission was flown against a Philippine target from a field in the Palaos, almost a month after the landing on Leyte. The islands, as it turned out, were not as valuable as anticipated nor used as extensively as planned. This cost us over 9,800 American lives. The primary purpose of the Leyte campaign was to establish an air and logistics base in the Leyte area in order to support future operations in the Luzon-Formosa China coast area, and particularly to nullify enemy strength on Luzon. The return to the Philippines was to be accomplished in 2 phases. The first would be a preliminary operation into the Sarangani Bay area of southern Mindanao to establish land-based air forces to augment the carrier-based air support for the principal effort. The major thrust was to be an amphibious landing with forces mounted from New Guinea to seize airfields and bases on Leyte. Because of its central location, the occupation of Leyte would split enemy forces in the Philippines. It would also provide an excellent anchorage in Leyte Gulf and sites for bases and airfields from which land-based aircraft could attack all parts of the Philippines, the coast of China and Formosa. Rapidly changing events in the conduct of the war made it possible to eliminate the first step into the Philippines and jump directly to the attack at Leyte, the 7th Fleet, under Vice Admiral T.C. Kincaid, was assigned the mission of supporting the landing. Pre-invasion bombardment was to commence on 17 October, with landings to be made on the 20th. As expected, the enemy responded to this attack with a massive naval operation destined to destroy the United States Navy units and crush the landing force. Once again, their plans were thwarted. Carrier-based aircraft continued to support the Leyte campaign till adequate facilities were constructed ashore. Marine aviation, in the form of a night fighter squadron and 4 Corsair-equipped fighter squadrons, were deployed to the Tacloban airfield from Peleliu. These squadrons operated for a little under 4 weeks at Leyte, but in that time flew 264 missions and destroyed 22 enemy ships and 40 aircraft. Once the decision was made to invade Leyte, it became necessary to determine the next step in the advance towards home islands. 2 courses of action were considered. The first was to bypass Luzon and jump to an invasion of southern Formosa with a simultaneous landing on the coast of China. This would provide an easier route to supply the eastern China airfields, which were to support B-29 raids against home islands. The second course of action was to invade Luzon and then work back to consolidate the entire Philippine archipelago. While it appeared that Formosa would be the best from a strategic point, Luzon was more favorable logistically. Enemy offensives in eastern and southeastern China overran the last air bases from which the China-based 14th Air Force could effectively support an invasion of either Formosa or Luzon. This reduced the urgency for the development of a port on the coast of China. By the same token, one of the main reasons for seizing Formosa to secure a stepping stone to China became much less desirable. In the end, the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided to invade Luzon, bypass Formosa, and continue the advance north through Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands. The best landing site on Luzon was Lingayen Gulf, the same approach used in 1941 to 1942 that led to Manila through the Central Plains. Airfield construction at Leyte continued to fall behind schedule, and aircraft based there would be unable to support the Lingayen Gulf invasion. The decision was made to route the invasion convoy through the confined waters of the Visayans, which required more air coverage than the previously considered route around the northern end of Luzon. To provide this cover, a base would be needed on Mindoro. The landings at Mindoro and Luzon stretched the amphibious shipping available to the utmost. This required numerous changes in plans and the dates that these landings, as well as the follow-on attacks against Iwo Jima and Okinawa, could take place. A few days prior to the Mindoro invasion, General George C. Kenney stated that the Army Air Forces would not be ready to take responsibility for air cover of the Mindoro convoy. In addition to the delays in building new airfields and weather problems, the inexperience of his pilots would preclude their taking off before daylight or landing after dark. Due to this, it was necessary to borrow escort carriers CVEs from the Central Pacific and arrange for Third Fleet cover and support and the help of land-based Central Pacific aircraft. The CVEs were to operate in the Sulu Sea to protect the convoy during hours when the Army Air Force could not be present. The aircraft complement on these ships was changed to 24 fighter and 9 torpedo bombers from the normal 16 and 12. Third Fleet's Task Force 38 was to prevent enemy forces from launching air attacks from Philippine fields during the approach, landing and unloading. The move to Mindoro was one of the boldest during the war in the Pacific. Driving this wedge into the central Philippines required bypassing several important enemy-held islands. This new airbase would be 262 miles away from our nearest base in Leyte and beyond the normal range of land-based fighter planes. On 13 December 1944, the main convoy was being protected by 12 aircraft from the CVEs and 35 land-based Marine Corsairs. At about 15 hours, a kamikaze Val sneaked in low from astern and crashed into the light cruiser Nashville, annihilating 133 personnel. Later, a destroyer was hit, resulting in a loss of 14. Several other kamikaze attacks were launched but were destroyed prior to reaching their target. The landing on the 15th was an amphibious group commander's dream as everything worked according to plan. That, however, was not to last. 12 minutes after the Army Air Force arrived to relieve the carrier-based aircraft, a kamikaze group arrived. Hits were made on a CVE and 2 landing ships. Tanks were destroyed. Air attacks against the later supply convoys were also conducted by kamikazes. By 30 January 1945, no enemy forces capable of organized action remained in northwest Mindoro, and further mopping up was left to the Filipino guerrillas. It had been a tough nut to crack, but the 4 airstrips constructed there were well worth the effort in the protection they gave convoys going to Luzon. By this time, the kamikaze corps, which had first been encountered during the battle for Leyte, had become a real problem to the Navy. It was estimated that 1 in 4 found a target and did some damage, and 1 in 33 sank a ship as it completed its one-way trip. All personnel returning to the United States and Australia were warned not to mention the kamikazes, and mail was carefully censored for any hint of them to prevent the enemy from knowing how effective the attacks were. It was not until April 1945, during the Okinawa campaign, when it was impossible to suppress the news that the world became aware of this new form of attack. One means of combating this threat was to change the aircraft complement aboard the big carriers. Essex-class carriers were to have 73 fighters, 15 bombers and 15 torpedo bombers in lieu of the 38, 36 and 18 previously carried. Task Force 38 left Ulithi on 11 December 1944 to make preliminary strikes on Luzon airfields, which threatened the Mindoro operation. Massive strikes over 3 days resulted in 270 aircraft destroyed and 3 or 4 freighters and 1 enemy-type landing ship, tank heavily damaged. Upon completion of these strikes on the 16th, Admiral William F. Halsey had hoped to be able to make his long-desired raid into the South China Sea, where the survivors of the enemy fleet had been reported after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. However, it was felt that the land-based air at Leyte was not yet sufficiently strong or reliable to risk moving the carriers from positions to cover Luzon. Task Force 38 was about to run into a typhoon, which was to cause more damage than the enemy had been able to inflict. 3 destroyers capsized and 6 or 7 other ships were seriously damaged, with a loss of almost 800 personnel. While attempting to refuel, they had run into a small, unreported typhoon. Several course changes were made to no avail because the center of the storm was unknown. The severity of the weather can be judged by the fact that the flight deck of Hancock, 57 feet above her waterline, scooped up green water. Pad eyes tore free from the deck and aircraft crashed about, catching fire. It is hard to believe that working under these conditions, men were still able to extinguish the fires and jettison damaged aircraft. While it was bad on the carriers and battleships, the destroyers had a worse time. One recorded a roll of 70 degrees and lay down on her side for 20 minutes, and yet survived. Unable to carry out the strikes scheduled for 19 to 21 December on Luzon airfields, the Third Fleet returned to Ulithi for repairs, rest and replenishment, leaving a few ships to continue to search for survivors. The plane complement of some carriers was changed again. 2 squadrons of Marine Corsair were assigned to Essex. She and Wasp now carried 91 fighter planes and 15 Avenger torpedo bombers. This was the first time that Marine aircraft had been assigned to the fast carriers. Task Force 38 departed Ulithi, and when 140 miles from the nearest Formosa airfields began strikes against Formosa, Okinawa, and Luzon. Bad weather hampered these strikes, but in 1 week Task Force 38 had flown more than 3,000 sorties and dropped approximately 700 tons of bombs. In accomplishing this, they lost 86 planes, 40 of which were operational losses. The attack convoy departed later for Lingayen Gulf and learned that there were still plenty of enemy aircraft in the Philippines. Kamikaze attacks began soon after the fleet entered the Sulu Sea. From there until they arrived off Lingayen Gulf, the convoy was subjected to numerous kamikaze attacks, which did considerable damage but sank only 1 CVE. Once the convoy arrived in the Gulf, things were no better. Between 3 and 6 January 1945, kamikaze attacks sank or damaged 25 ships, 3 of which suffered 2 or more attacks. The effectiveness of this new tactic is vividly revealed considering that there were only 28 kamikazes and 15 fighter escorts involved. The enemy determined not to defend the beaches and concentrated their defenses in the mountains, making the preliminary shore bombardments unnecessary. The ships lost in this portion of the operation, however, had sacrificially served the invasion by acting as bait for the kamikazes, who expended themselves before the day of the landing. The amphibious force was also attacked by kamikazes, but not to the extent that the bombardment and fire support group or the minesweeping and hydrographic group had been previously. The actual landing proceeded like a textbook exercise. There were few kamikaze attacks against shipping, but by the end of the day, about 30,000 tons of supplies had been landed, and attack troops had advanced as much as 8,000 yards. The enemy still had one more new weapon in their bag of tricks. On the night of the landing, a group of 18-foot suicide boats attacked the fleet. One ship was sunk and 8 others damaged. These boats made no further attacks at Lingayen Gulf. With the troops ashore and proceeding towards their objectives as planned, the next step was to secure the long supply line between Mindoro and Lingayen Gulf from all means of counterattack between Tokyo and Singapore. A strike was made on Cameron Bay on 12 January 1945. There were no combatant ships as anticipated, but numerous merchant ships were sunk or damaged. Many were oilers. Saigon was also struck, and docks, airfield facilities, and oil storage ashore were hit. Sailing north on 15 January, Task Force 38 launched strikes against airfields on the China coast and Formosa. Several ships were sunk, but only 16 aircraft were shot down, and an additional 18 destroyed on the ground. More strikes were made against the China coast and on down to Hong Kong. Once again, the weather was bad, and Navy losses were greater than the enemy. Most were due to anti-aircraft fire, and the low altitude the aircraft were required to fly. After refueling and avoiding some additional bad weather, the fleet retired to the north around the northern end of Luzon. Again, on 21 January, fighter sweeps were launched to neutralize airfields in Formosa, the Pescadores, and the Sakishima Gunto. Flying all day, with emphasis on shipping in the morning and airfields in the afternoon, a total of 1,164 sorties were flown with 104 aircraft claimed destroyed on the ground. It was a different matter at sea as the kamikazes came to life again. Langley, Ticonderoga, and Maddox were struck. Ticonderoga was hit by 2 different strikes. Upon landing aboard Hancock, one of our torpedo bombers was taxiing up the deck and dropped a 500-pound bomb out of the bomb bay. The bomb exploded. Casualties were heavy, 50, 2 annihilated and 105 wounded. During the 22nd, a total of 682 sorties were flown against Okinawa to obtain photographic coverage for the forthcoming capture of the island. That night, Task Force 38 started south and returned to Ulithi for a well-earned rest. The Marine Corps dive bomber squadrons, which were requested from the Northern Solomons, went ashore and established an airfield near Dagupan to support the 1st Cavalry Division in its dash to Manila. Close air support procedures had been worked out with the Army while still in the Solomons, placing a forward air controller with a radio-equipped jeep with each battalion. This, for all practical purposes, placed a forward observer, who was a naval aviator, at the command posts who understood an aviator's requirements and could properly direct him to the target. The SBDs of Marine Air Groups 24 and 32 guarded the flanks of the 1st Cavalry Division and destroyed hard points in front of the advance as they spearheaded the dash to Manila. There were numerous small landings after Luzon that followed the same general pattern of the enemy retiring to inland positions and a final mop-up by guerrilla forces. As there were no enemy aircraft operating in the southern Philippines, the fleet did not suffer any kamikaze damage. The 8th Army determined that it had conducted 14 major and 24 minor landings in 44 days, and the 7th Amphibious Forces hung up a record for amphibious operations that is not likely to be challenged. Naval Aviation had one more operation in the Philippines when Marine Air Groups 12, 14 and 32 were assigned the mission of close air support for the 41st Division in the attack on Zamboanga, Mindanao. After the initial shore bombardment, the attack forces quickly moved inland. The Marine SBDs flew in from Luzon in support of the advance to supplement the F-4U Corsairs of Marine Air Group 12. Heavy fighting took place in the hills as the Army slowly advanced, supported by Marine Corps planes and gunfire from the cruisers and destroyers offshore. These ships left on 12 March as they were needed for another landing, and their task was taken over by destroyers which continued to deliver call fire until the 18th. Missions continued to be flown in support of operations at Davao, Malabang and Sarangani Bay on the island of Mindanao, as well as on the island of Jolo. The last hurrah for the SBD was on 31 July 1945 when the aircraft struck enemy positions along the Davao River. This was the last SBD strike of the war. The airplane that had destroyed the might of the enemy fleet was no more. The obligation was honored to all of those military and civilian personnel who had been abandoned 3 long years. The debt was paid. We had returned. Within the Navy Department, the Bureau of Aeronautics was responsible for aircraft and the Bureau of Ordnance for ordnance. The general lines were clear, but the details involved in properly fitting bombs and guns in naval aircraft required understanding and accommodation. Thus, the officer with aeronautical responsibilities for the coordinator of research and development told me that his greatest achievement was to introduce the man in Bureau of Aeronautics responsible for putting guns in airplanes to the man in Des Moines, Bureau of Ordnance responsible for getting the gun. The files indicate that he spent much more time trying to coordinate disparate projects involving highly classified guided missiles and rockets. A 1941 Army-Navy agreement assigned cross-service responsibilities. Army Ordnance developed and procured most aircraft guns and general-purpose and semi-armor-piercing bombs. Bureau of Ordnance similarly handled armor-piercing and anti-submarine bombs, that is, depth charges. In nomenclature, the letter M indicated equipment was Army-developed, and MAC, or Mark, indicated it was Navy-developed. The prefix AN meant that the gear had been tested and approved, standardized by both services. The frequency of this prefix indicated a seldom noted but highly successful example of inter-service cooperation in areas of massive production and use. After World War I, .30 caliber machine guns were generally mounted in naval aircraft for both offensive and defensive missions. Heavier but more powerful .50 caliber guns were adopted in 1935 for installation in new naval aircraft. By the end of 1941, most operational aircraft were equipped with .50s. Two larger guns were being developed in 1939, a .60 caliber adaptation of the German 20mm Mauser and a 20mm Hispano-Suiza, a French design. During the war, improvements to the .50 caliber continued. In the decade 1935 to 1945, firing rate doubled from 600 to 1,200 rounds per minute. At the same time, muzzle velocity and magazine capacity were increased. Remote charging mechanisms, hydraulic, pneumatic, and remote electric triggers were developed, which increased the flexibility in mounting guns and permitted underwing mounts and gun packages in lieu of bombs. A new satellite gun barrel, developed by the National Defense Research Committee, National Defense Research Council, greatly improved barrel life. Development of the .60 caliber gun continued while the 20mm was placed in service. The F-4U-1C fighters were fitted with 4 20mm guns in lieu of 6 .50 caliber guns in other Corsairs and in F-6F Hellcats. The SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber, in most models, was equipped with 2 20mm guns. The twin-engine F-7F Tigercat, being readied for service at the end of the war, was fitted with a mixed battery of 4 .50 caliber and 4 20mm guns. By the late 30s, larger guns, multiple gun installations, and higher aircraft speeds made the aiming of flexible guns difficult and led to power-driven gun turrets. The Navy's first aircraft gun turret project began in June 1937 as part of the XPBM-1 patrol plane development. The first turret-equipped aircraft to be operated by the Navy, however, was the PBO Hudson patrol plane built for the British by Lockheed and obtained in the fall of 1941 for anti-submarine warfare patrol from northern bases during the coming winter. The PBO turret contained twin .30 caliber guns. Following the XPBM-1, all new dive bomber, torpedo plane and patrol plane developments included turrets. A turret was developed with the XTBF-1 Avenger, and combat Avengers used turrets throughout the war. A similarly developed turret for the SB-2C was installed in early production aircraft, but was removed during the Helldiver's prolonged teething period. The first Navy-developed turrets were fitted with a single .50 caliber gun, but later models contained twin or quad mounts, while 20mm turrets were under development. Gyro-stabilized, lead computing sights were going into production at the end of the war, and radar-controlled turrets were under development. Efforts to develop a lightweight, high-performance drive failed because of production problems, as did efforts towards a standardized turret intended for various positions on different aircraft. Operational patrol planes were fitted with turrets, although when early PBM Mariners were found to be underpowered, the turret was one of the items removed in a weight reduction program. Turrets were developed for many new aircraft that never went beyond experimental status. As one example, Remote-controlled upper and lower turrets developed for the Douglas XSB-2D-1 dive bomber preceded similar turrets installed in the Army's Douglas A-26 Invader. Gun turrets continued to be of interest in aircraft development for a few years after the end of the war, but a variety of tactical, technical, and strategic factors led to their abandonment. Aircraft armor was of little interest in the interwar years, as its weight would have penalized aircraft performance. In 1938, as war shadows darkened, Bureau of Aeronautics began studying armor for aircraft pilots, and the next year specified that new experimental aircraft contain space and weight provisions for armored seats or bulkheads. Basic investigation was also conducted into the effectiveness of various steel and aluminum alloys. In mid-1940, Bureau of Aeronautics ordered armor that could protect against .50 caliber bullets fired from 200 yards. About the same time, it requested that airframe contractors design armor installations for various service, production, and experimental aircraft, and in 1941, contractors were made responsible for armor procurement and installation. By the end of 1941, armor ordered by Bureau of Aeronautics had been received, and new aircraft were delivered with armor already installed. The timing was fortuitous, as we entered the war with most aircraft equipped with armor. The importance of armor was noted by Pacific Fleet analysts, who considered it a significant factor in the favorable survival rate of our fighters at Midway. The main parameters laid out from 1938 to 1941 did not change during the war. Concern for performance led to some relaxation of requirements from early 1942 into 1944, but a redefined .50 caliber protection standard was adopted by February 1944. Efforts to improve protection included continual study of various compositions of homogeneous and case-hardened armor. Tests of laminated nylon in May 1941 were so promising that 3 years were devoted to an unsuccessful effort to substitute transparent plastic for bullet-resistant glass. Flak suit, helmet, and fuselage curtain investigations began in 1943 and led to production orders in March 1945, too late for larger-scale wartime use. World War II brought about a resurgence in the use of rockets. The major European combatants all had extensive rocket programs, and the long-range German V-2 was the most spectacular of many weapons. The Russians, in 1941, strafed invading German troops with airborne rockets. In America, interwar rocket development was in the hands of a few dedicated individuals, most notably Dr. Robert H. Goddard. Total United States production of military rockets zoomed from zero in 1940 to 1 billion rounds per year by 1945. American military rocket programs began in mid-1940 at the behest of National Defense Research Council. Bureau of Ordnance agreed that rocket propulsion could increase the penetration of large armor-piercing bombs. Thus, a National Defense Research Council rocket program commenced at Naval Proving Grounds, Dahlgren, Virginia, but was soon relocated to Naval Powder Factory, Indian Head, Maryland. In mid-1941, the National Defense Research Council rocket program was expanded and realigned. The East Coast effort was relocated to George Washington University, Washington, District of Columbia. The West Coast effort was begun by the California Institute of Technology, which did the most work of naval interest. Initial tests were carried out at Salton Sea and some of the dry lakes in the Mojave Desert. The first airborne tests were at Goldstone Lake. In the fall of 1943, Navy tests were concentrated in the China Lake area, and in November, Naval Ordnance Test Station, Inyokern, forerunner of today's Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division, was established. The first United States Navy rocket grew out of a 7.2-inch British anti-submarine projectile, Hedgehog, which could be fired by destroyers or larger ships. The United States Navy used the same warhead but converted it to a rocket, Mousetrap, which being recoilless could be used by smaller vessels. California Institute of Technology also redesigned the warhead to increase explosive load and improve range. The Navy's first airborne rocket was adapted from Mousetrap. Magnetic airborne detector gear enabled a low-flying airplane to detect a submarine directly under it. A vertical fall weapon, needed to utilize that information, was obtained by increasing Mousetrap's propulsive charge so that when it was fired astern by an airplane, it would hopefully drop vertically onto the submarine. The first airborne firing was at Goldstone Lake on 3 July 1942. Development continued for a year and retro rockets were procured for service in late 1943 for issue to magnetic airborne detectors-equipped squadrons. Successes of British and Russian airborne rockets led the Navy to begin development of forward-firing aircraft rockets in June 1943. Expected advantages included greater range, accuracy, and velocity than bombs, greater striking power than machine guns, and less weight than heavy guns. California Institute of Technology, Bureau of Ordnance, and Commander Fleet Air, West Coast, cooperated. The first experimental firing on 14 July at Goldstone Lake came just 5 weeks after the go-ahead. In a little more than 2 years, 5 different aircraft rockets were developed, and factories and loading plants were erected or converted, so that in July 1945 nearly 530,000 aircraft rockets were manufactured. To achieve this, California Institute of Technology and Naval Ordnance Test Station began initial production of a model before development was complete, providing for testing and early operational use while obtaining the configuration needed for mass production. Every feasible shortcut was taken. Therefore, the first rocket, the 3.5-inch aircraft rocket, was adapted from a British anti-submarine warfare rocket. It had a 3.25-inch motor, but its 3.5-inch head was redesigned to double underwater travel. An explosive head was also developed for use against surface targets. The second, a 5-inch aircraft rocket, was obtained by attaching a refused 5-inch gun projectile to the same 3.25-inch motor. Thereby, an airplane was literally given the punch of a destroyer salvo. A third rocket used a newly developed 5-inch motor attached to the 5-inch warhead, restoring range and speed. This round, the high-velocity aircraft rocket, or more popularly Holy Moses, was air-delivered to Europe and first used in July 1944 by the Army in the Saint-Lô area of France prior to the breakout from Normandy. The fourth rocket, Tiny Tim, involved an 11.75-inch motor for the 500-pound semi-armor-piercing bomb, providing a round slightly heavier than a 1,000-pound bomb. Combat introduction by the carrier Franklin at Okinawa failed because a kamikaze devastated the ship before it made a Tiny Tim strike. Hence, Tiny Tim's World War II use was very limited. The fifth rocket was SCAR, a 2.25-inch sub-caliber aircraft rocket used for training. Manufacturing began in January 1945, and by July accounted for about half of the Navy's aircraft rocket production. The first aircraft rocket launcher was a British type, ordered in August 1943 for 200 TBM Avenger torpedo planes. Being slotted aluminum rails about 90 inches long, they lowered aircraft performance, particularly in multiple installations. Tests, in which the rails were progressively shortened, showed no loss of accuracy. Launch stability and accuracy were provided by 200 knots airspeed. The rails were replaced by 2 posts, which released the rocket after less than an inch of travel. These zero-length mounts went into production in May 1945. The aircraft rockets used fixed fins for stability, but some effort went into pop-up fins and spin-stabilized rockets. Such rounds could be stowed much more densely than fin-stabilized rounds. Launchers were also developed. One was similar to a revolver in that the rounds were stored in a rotating carriage and fired sequentially. Another, developed by Douglas Aircraft as part of the XBT-2D AD Skyraider, stored rounds inside the wing and moved them horizontally into firing position. Accurate fire control instruments and trained crew made ships' gunfire very accurate. Limits on space, weight, time, and crew necessitated simple solutions to airborne fire control problems, primarily simple sights enhanced by a seaman's eye and doctrine based on past experience. Precise instruments, while theoretically possible, were not practical. For example, the highly accurate Norden bomb sight, developed by Bureau of Ordnance in the 20s and early 30s, required a stabilized run of several seconds and had to be used at high altitudes to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. In consequence, ships avoided falling bombs by maneuvering. Of the over 40,000 bomb sights produced, most were used by the Army. Of the nearly 6,500 kept by the Navy, only the stabilized bombing approach equipment was generally used. It made an excellent automatic pilot. Despite considerable development, effort bomb, torpedo and rocket fire control relied heavily upon sights for fixed guns with varying doctrinal procedures for the different weapons. The major exception was a toss bombing site, Bomb Director Mark 1, which utilized speed, dive angle, and altitude to compute the release point. Through the 1930s, ring and post sights, similar to those on a hunting rifle, were used to aim fixed guns. Aside from requiring the pilot's concentration at the expense of other tasks, their major drawback was in giving no estimate of lead. In 1937, Bureau of Ordnance began development of lead computing sights incorporating gyroscopic stabilization and control. The first models were unsatisfactory, and two other types of gun sights were undertaken in 1941. A telescopic sight unacceptably narrowed the user's vision. Illuminated sights were also designed. In these, the image of a bore-sighted lens was reflected onto a glass plate within the user's normal field of vision. A Navy design and a modified British design were developed. The Mach 8 illuminated sight for fixed guns and the Mach 9 for flexible guns were developed, produced and placed in service early in the war, filling a vital need in aviation ordnance. Development of the more complex but potentially more useful lead computing sight continued. The Mk-18 for use with flexible guns was in fairly wide use by the end of the war. The result, as the Bureau of Ordnance historians reported, was that firepower of aircraft turret guns went up. Ammunition expenditures dropped. A similar sight for fixed guns entered service in 1945 but had not found widespread acceptance by war's end. Many factors led to increased use of carrier catapults. Most wartime changes increased weight and, even with more powerful engines, lengthened takeoff run. Takeoffs were affected by the carrier's deck length and speed. As the war progressed, aircraft strikes became larger, which shortened the deck length available for the first planes off. Both the light carrier CVL and the escort carrier CVE had short flight decks, and the CVE had only about half the speed of a fast carrier. Therefore, as the war progressed, catapulting became more important. Before World War II, carrier catapults were used for limited experimental purposes. This was despite the fact that from the earliest days of naval aviation, catapults were viewed as a means of operating aircraft from ships. During the interwar years, catapults were installed on battleships and cruisers and quickly became essential for their aircraft operations. Based on 1940 tests, plans were even made to install catapults on some new destroyers. The Navy's first carrier, Langley, commissioned in 1923, had bow and stern catapults for launching seaplanes. In the spring of 1925, a land plane was catapulted from the ship, but no follow-up appears to have been made. In fact, her catapults were removed in mid-1928 because they had not been used for 3 years. Despite that, flywheel catapults for launching seaplanes were installed on the Navy's next carriers, Lexington and Saratoga. 2 powder catapults planned for athwart ships mounting on the hangar deck of Ranger, the first United States ship designed as a carrier, were eliminated to save money. A 1934 proposal to install the first experimental flush-deck catapult on Ranger's flight deck was overridden on the grounds that catapults belonged on the hangar deck. Ranger finally received catapults in 1944. In mid-1931, the Navy began design of flush-deck catapults, both powder and compressed air, that could be installed on the hangar deck to launch land planes. Hydro-pneumatic catapults soon followed, and in November 1934, the Naval Aircraft Factory, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, began constructing the H-1 flush-deck catapult. Yorktown and Enterprise, commissioned in 1937 and 1938, as well as a few subsequent carriers, were each fitted with an athwartship's catapult on the hangar deck, along with 2 bow catapults on the flight deck. Both ships made their first catapult launches on 4 August 1939, scarcely a month before the outbreak of war in Europe. Wasp, during her first year of operation, mid-1940 to 1941, made only 3 dozen live catapult launches. After the United States joined the war, hangar deck catapults were removed from existing carriers. Until mid-1943, however, Essex-class carrier plans called for hangar deck catapults. In April 1943, Enterprise recommended her catapults be removed because they were so limited to small, slow airplanes that they were of no use. Instead, they were replaced with updated H-21 catapults, capable of accelerating an 11,000-pound airplane to 70 miles per hour in a 73-foot run. In February 1944, Commander Naval Air Force, Pacific Fleet, reported that catapults were important for all carriers and were vital for CVEs and CVLs. They became so essential to the CVE mission of aircraft resupply that all Army fighters earmarked for the Pacific were fitted for catapults while on the production line. Most catapult development was carried out by the Naval Air Material Center, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and its predecessor, Naval Aircraft Factory. Catapults for carriers, battleships, and cruisers underwent continuous improvement. Several specialized catapults were developed. Expeditionary catapults for overseas bases were diverted to training command air stations. A catapult to launch a 60,000-pound flying boat from a large barge was designed, built, and tested, and plans were made to join two of them to launch a 120,000-pound flying boat. Conversion of the Mars PB-2M patrol planes to JRM transports and cancellation of other large flying boat projects eliminated those needs. Jet-assisted takeoff, developed by Engineering Experimental Station, Annapolis, Maryland, and California Institute of Technology, eliminated the need for catapulting smaller boats. A spring catapult to launch Cub aircraft from landing ships, tank, was tested. The Army's Brody gear with a wire cable for landing and takeoff was installed on one landing ship, tank. In later experiments, pressure in a hydraulic catapult neared the critical point where fluid would flash into vapor with an enormous increase in volume and the potential for a disastrous explosion. In December 1944, based upon a German device, study of a slotted cylinder catapult began. Fluid pressure moves a piston through a cylinder, and a linkage through the slot connects the airplane and piston so they move together. The key element is a flexible sealing strip that tightly closes the slot behind the piston. Activating fluids studied included gas, steam, and fuel oil. Thus, if the steam catapult was not anticipated, its possibility was foreseen. On a more urgent level, at war's end, projects were underway to improve almost every detail of catapults, including improved bridle catchers, retracting chains to reposition battleship and cruiser catapults, and piston decelerators. Looking to the immediate future, the XH-8 hydro-pneumatic catapult was developed for jet aircraft. The goal was to launch a 15,000-pound aircraft at 120 miles per hour with 40-second intervals between launches. Flywheel catapults, based on those originally on Lexington and Saratoga, were studied. A large spinning flywheel stored a lot of energy, but problems with the clutching mechanism were never solved. Electric catapults were tested. An electric motor's rotor and stator were replaced by flat surfaces so that electricity pulled one over the other, directly providing forward motion. An electric catapult was operated at Patuxent River, Maryland, for several years. A brief article cannot thoroughly survey the vast scope of aeronautical development. During the war, improvements were made in almost everything involving flight and flight support. Shipboard gear, such as arresting gear, barriers and barricades, safety and survival gear, including oxygen equipment, anti-G suits and life rafts, aircraft instruments, serological and meteorological equipment, photographic equipment and interpretation, link trainers and target aircraft and kites for training, and construction materials and finishes. The list could go on and on. A follow-on half-century of vigorous development of military technology has yielded few entirely new areas, notably lasers, transistors, infrared devices, supersonic aerodynamics, and flight and high-altitude photography. Science and engineering have made great refinements in all areas of naval aviation, but in most respects, modern equipment can be traced to World War II antecedents.